Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome to /Data's newest webinar edition, Developer Psychographics and How Developers Perceive Themselves, which will be presented by our Director of Research, our very own Christina Voskoglu. But before we get to the main event, some directions on today. So if you have any questions, or we will be saving questions for the end. If you have questions as well throughout the discussion, feel free to add those into the chat and add your name or where you're from or something so that we can identify where you're from and make sure to answer that. I will be emceeing for the next hour. So before we get into the topics, again, I realize some of you know us quite well and others less so. Thus, to offer a bit of background on who we are and what we do, and of course, get you to know where the data you're about to see comes from. /Data is a developer analyst firm. In other words, we are hyper-focused in helping top tech companies understand developers. Within our global surveys, we help uncover who developers are, understanding their profiles, where they are, what they are involved in, population metrics, and even segmentation. We explore what they buy, so technology usage, adoption, and what affects developer purchase decisions. And lastly, where they are going, so developer perception about emerging technologies and which areas they are going to next. Here is in the next slide, a quick snapshot of some of the companies we work with. If you see your logo here and you haven't had a chance to access our research, do let us know and we'll guide you to it. If you don't and you have any questions, happy to connect and see how we can help as well. Getting into the research, within our global surveys, we capture about 10 developer audiences. So everyone here on the left, from mobile, desktop, IoT, and AR, VR, machine learning. Important to note, these are not distinct people. Developers tend to work in multiple areas. There is indeed much overlap in the surveys and in the data. We run 2 global surveys per year, pulling the responses of more than 30,000 developers annually, reaching about 160 countries. It is a very broad reach and a truly representative sample of the community. And we do this by not tapping into one single community out there, but we use anywhere from 70 to 100 channels, including everything from developer language groups to Slack channels to paid channels and vendor communities. So far, we've run about 18 surveys, so very soon we will be celebrating our 10 years of running these global surveys. Going to the next slide. In this presentation, we are focused on the data stemming from our 17th global wave. You will see the regional breakdown here to give you an idea of the spread of the particular audience we're talking about. Yep, and I think that's good for our side. Now with that, I will pass the discussion on to Christina, who will continue and dive into the topics for today on developer psychographics.
Okay, thank you, Mosfula. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to be here with you today to discuss developer psychographics. So here's our agenda. First of all, we'll start off by briefly going over segmentation. Perhaps some of you may recall that we did another webinar a few months back on developer segmentation, where we discussed the need for that and the best practices as to how to go about it. And in that webinar, in fact, we got some questions from participants asking whether it makes sense to include psychographics in a segmentation model. So based on that, we asked developers in our 17th survey how they perceive themselves. And we will be showing you that, answers to that question. And also we'll be showing you then the profile, so how these perceptions really vary across several factors, such as role, industry, not industry, rather technology sectors, age, and so on. Then we'll discuss whether it's worth it, the whole exercise. Can psychographic profiling be used in any meaningful way in the context of developer marketing? Can it predict or affect developer choices? Then we'll wrap it all up and therefore give you our perspective on it as to how and when to use psychographics. And in the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions, hold on to them, just add them in the chat, I guess, and then we'll be able to discuss them in full at the end. All right, so here we go. The need for developer segmentation. So we usually, we typically survey developers, but we also run surveys on developer marketing leaders every now and then, and they have been repeatedly telling us that they do segment their audience. More than 90% of them do so, and there's a good reason for that, because if you segment your audience in the right way, that may help you identify clusters that are more likely to respond positively to your outreach and developer program efforts, and therefore increase the ROI of these activities. Now, unfortunately, this is often done in a non-advisable way, let's say, because some practitioners tend to make too many prior assumptions as to what their personas should look like. And they include, for example, in their descriptions, technology choices, or what languages they use, or what platforms, or app categories, and so on. Which sort of beats the purpose, because this is what you are trying to predict. It should be your dependent variable. So technologies change over time, new ones come along, and if you include them in your segment definition, that definition will soon become obsolete. Plus, it will not be very helpful in defining and predicting behaviors or explaining them. What we do instead is that we just let our data speak. We don't even trust our own opinions or assumptions, so we just trust our data instead. And we run models, including things such as demographics, motivations, roles, and many, many more, but exclude everything that's technology related. So all technology choices are out. And our models then come up with the most important descriptors of developer profiles and with segments that are really powerful in predicting developer behavior. So we run this sort of exercise across the whole developer population. Of course, you can repeat it for any subset of that population that may be of interest. Running it for the whole developer population led us to identifying 6 personas, distinct personas that I'm showing you here. Although we didn't make any assumptions, as I said, the model did come up with personas that roughly follow the evolution, so the journey of developers from young learners to seasoned decision makers, with some side tracks here. So they have the inexperienced loners who are just doing their own thing on the side without really that being their path to anything. And we also have the emerging extenders who will not don't really care about becoming any corporate decision makers. They are just usually startuppers who are just extending their knowledge in the mature sectors over to the more emerging ones to create an innovative solution and monetize that. Okay, so does that work? Yes, it does. We tried it with a different set of things. So, for example, we were showing you here if these 6 personas are any use at all in understanding attitude towards emerging technologies. We track several emerging technologies here, just showing you 2, DevOps and robotics. Clearly they do differ in their likelihood to care about emerging technologies. For example, seasoned decision makers here are far more, and middle standards are far more into DevOps than others, while the emerging extenders are far more interested in robotics. And as you can see, inexperienced loners are not into anything much because, of course, they're inexperienced and they're struggling to figure out the basics for now. So they wouldn't go into the emerging stuff as yet. So we find similar differences when we look at tool usage, for example, number of tools they use and which ones they prefer. So this kind of segmentation does work. The question is, should you also be including psychographics? Okay, so here it is. We asked developers and got responses from more than 16,000 on this question. So we provided them with this list of 21 descriptors. Some are more serious than others. And we told them to pick up to 5 to describe themselves. So of course, in a sector that places logic and clear thinking and clear definitions, in the center of everything, it's not surprising that the majorities of 58% say they are logical, right? But flipping it over, what is surprising is that it's only 58%. So it is a rather small majority. I mean, there are even jokes, right, about how logical developers are. So you would expect this to be higher. Well, what we're looking at here is not just pure programmers, it's all anyone, so everyone who is into development in some way. So that includes also designers, it includes engineering team leads, CTOs, and so on. So you could say that it's partly because of the side roles, let's say, in development, that this is not so high. However, if we limit that to just the programmers and software developers strictly, not even the more specialized roles in development, just programmers, it's still low. It's 60%. Anyway, more about roles later. This is really important. Now, we also see team players and introverts, second place, that's a tie. Some way behind, of course, the logical profile. So again, I think what's important here to know is less than half consider themselves team players. So that's something to note, that they prefer being on their own, and therefore efforts, any messaging should not, include too much about support for teams and so on. Then we also included here some descriptors that have to do with their spare time, so how they spend their spare time, because that's also important. And the top descriptor in that group is reader. So 33% say they're readers. And then that's followed by gamers at 31%. It may sound irrelevant, but it has its uses as a descriptor. And then other activities such as music and sport scored lower at 20 and 17 respectively. Now, we also included some unusual labels here, which you may see at the bottom, which made for some interesting analysis. Okay, dog lovers and cat people. This was mostly fun because we keep getting developers commenting about the need to add GIFs with kittens in our survey. So we just want to know how many cat people there are out there. Not that many, few. So we're okay. But there are other things that beyond the funny aspect that may be useful. So night owls there. You may see there are far more night owls as compared to early birds. And that may actually come in handy when you're deciding what time during the day to send a campaign. So every little helps. Now, some of these characteristics can be grouped in conflicting characters, let's say. So first of all is introvert versus extrovert. So there's also a lot of discussion about how introverted developers are. And they are indeed. Okay, so it's only 37%. You, again, might have expected that to be higher, but it is higher, a lot higher in the opposite direction as compared to the wider population out there. So based on research that exists out there, not sure how accurately that can be measured, but it is said that the ratio of extroverts to introverts is 2 to 1. However, here the scales are tipped the other way, and far more. So there are nearly 4 to 1 introverts to extroverts. So that's really big. So indeed, there is some basis to all the claims that developers are more introverted. Sorry, although they're not in their majority. Now, about introvert, team player, and loner. Note there at the bottom of the left, the opposite of team player is loner and not introvert. Because being an introvert is not necessarily at odds with being a team player. In fact, we found that a quarter, so 25% of those that say that are introverts also say they're team players. So in comparison, of course, that's not the most common combination, because in comparison, 50% of extroverts say they're team players. So of course, introverts are less of team players than extroverts, but the combination does exist, and we will see again, it's more common among specific roles than in others. Another interesting pair of conflicting characteristics is that of all-rounders versus specialists. So compared to all the other pairs here, in this one, the difference in popularity is rather small. So all-rounders dominate over specialists with 29 to 21%, as compared, for example, to logical versus sensing, where the mix is the ratio is 58 to 13%. Now, this means that the description of all-rounder is not, as it may first seem, a direct opposite of specialist. In fact, the overlap between the two is quite substantial. 27% of specialists say they're also all-rounders. We don't observe that kind of overlap in other conflicting pairs. For example, only 7% of team players also say they're loners, which is a weird combination, but weird combinations will exist. And the overlap is even greater than that 27% within specific roles. We'll discuss that in a minute. Now, going into the profile. So how does this mix change across several factors? So first of all, technology areas. We picked here 6 out of the 10 plus that we track. And we select also 4 attributes, so logical, gamer, artistic, and introvert, and compare those 4 across the 6 sectors. So as you can see, web, desktop, and backend developers are the most logical, sober guys, while those in AR, VR, and games are significantly less so. And in fact, in games, so of course, you would expect a game developer to like games, right? So, but what is interesting here is that games is the only sector where logical comes second as a descriptor. There are more gamers than logical. Don't know if that's good or bad, but that's how it is. Now, game developers, AR and VR developers are comparatively less likely to apply the term logical to themselves compared to others working in other sectors. So these are the 3 sectors with less logical people in them. Also, those in these 3 areas are the most likely to describe themselves as artistic, especially those into AR and VR. They are double as artistic as backend developers, for example. And AR, VR developers are also the least introverted, especially those into VR. Now, bear in mind that these 2 areas, AR and VR, there are relatively more designers and artists, given the democratization of these areas gradually happening, which explains both the stronger artistic inclination and the higher extroversion of this sector. Now, more about the psychographics of different roles, as I said, just in the next slide. So overall, those working in game development, backend, and web are selecting the introvert label in highest proportion. So at least game developers have that in common with backend developers, while those in AR, VR, and IoT are less likely to do so. All right, and finally into roles. As I said repeatedly in the last few minutes, there is the role is very important, and we discussed specifically about the overlap between all-rounders and specialists, and said that the extent of the overlap is highly dependent on role. Indeed, here you can see on the left bottom, so this is again some of the roles that we track, not all, they wouldn't fit, plus some of the key psychographic attributes, and we see how likely are programmers to be, let's say, logical as compared to data scientists and so on. So here you can see that programmers don't describe themselves as neither all-rounders nor specialists. They're in the red for both of those. On the contrary, DevOps specialists consider themselves to be both, significantly more than others on average. In fact, 42% for DevOps specialists, they have the second highest percentage of all-rounders, which maybe seem odd, but in fact, such roles typically require a deep specialist knowledge within an area, but the best practitioners also have an additional ability to integrate and coordinate across a broad range of technical areas, hence the all-rounder characteristic. We also observe the interesting combination of introverts and team players that we discussed earlier. So if you see, programmers are in the green for both of these, while those in high managerial positions, so CEOs and so on, don't describe themselves as either. And with respect to introvert, I guess that's good. With respect to team players, I'm not that sure, but never mind. Now, speaking of managers, along with the marketing guys, who are of course expected to be the least introverted, the tech leads, so CTOs, CIOs, and so on, are also the least likely to be introverted. So given the fact that I guess they started their careers as simple programmers who, as we see here, are the exact opposite. They are introverts. So what happened? So it's hard to tell if you know, the senior roles naturally attract extroverts. So the extroverts out of the programmers progress to becoming managers, or if those of them who did advance become less introverted as they progressed, driven by the need to communicate and work in a team. So is the chicken or the egg? We cannot tell. So then also as expected, UX designers, and we have the exact same picture for UI designers, just do not here, are the most artistic by far. And there is high concentration, as we said, of them in AR and VR areas. Which therefore is what explains the high artistic percentage in those areas. They're also the least logical and team players. So perhaps trying to reason with them about teamwork won't get you very far. Finally, we find the most readers among data scientists, ML developers. Notice that they seem to have a different profile than the programmers and software developers. They're a different gang. So they like to read. So probably providing them with a nice read is a good idea. Finally, another factor that appears very correlated with psychographics is age. Of course, it makes sense because as we age and gain experience, our perspectives change, and this naturally affects how we describe ourselves. Also, different generations of developers have very different life experiences and interests, which is also reflected in their self-description. Now, being a gamer is the most correlated with age. You can see it dropping sharply as we grow, sadly. So more than 1 in 3 developers up to the age of 34 years consider themselves to be a gamer, compared to fewer than 1 in 4 of the 35 to 44 group, and fewer than 1 in 5 of the 44 or 54s. And so other than the obvious reasons behind this trend, we should also bear in mind that the younger developers have been exposed to more technology, to more gaming as they grew up. So they came of age alongside a massive rise in smartphone gaming, consoles, and so on. So this is likely to have played its part in the way they relate to games. And instead of gaming, older developers are more likely to be readers when compared to the younger groups. So being a reader goes up with age. Now, while gamer and reader show opposite correlation with age, one dropping, the other one increasing, the other two interesting features, all-rounder specialists, seem to move in the same direction, both increasing with age and stabilizing above 45. Now, this again points to the previous finding that these concepts only, come into view as you grow older. So developers seem to start considering these concepts later on and not at the onset of their careers. By the way, we saw that programmers don't consider themselves as um, either of these, and age is behind that as well, because programmers typically, we find, are younger, so their age distribution is shifted downwards as compared to the DevOps specialists, and any specialist doesn't matter. Therefore, it was really, at least partly, it was age that was hidden behind what we observed earlier. Right, so on top of the 21 words that we provided to developers, we also allowed them to describe themselves in their own words. So we gave them an open text field, and we got more than 300 responses in those open text fields, which range from analytical to zoned out. And they're curious, enthusiastic, friendly geeks, innovative, lazy leaders. We even had a lizard, which was scary, but never mind. And it's good to see that they describe themselves as entrepreneurs, for example, curious, creative leaders. And this word cloud really adds to the point that there's no single profile out there. And of course, they're different, and you should be catering to the different profiles. All right, so we do see some variability. There's, of course, other factors, so across, let's say, decision-making levels or industries that we see differentiations. We cannot go through all of them today, but you get the picture. The question is, all right, we have different profiles. So what? Does it matter anywhere? Does it affect developer choices? Can it be used in any way? So although psychographics, in our view, should be used with care, more on that in a minute, there are cases where they may come in handy. For one, psychographics may affect the way in which developers prefer to learn to code. Now, here we show you some of the ways in which they learn to code. We've asked for about a few more than that. Now, self-taught is by far the most popular educational choice method, for developers across the whole population. But the popularity of this method varies with psychographic profile. So loners and night owls are the most likely to self-teach the code, while sporty developers, extroverts, and team players are the least likely to do so. A note here about sporty: it may sound odd and out of place here and irrelevant. Well, sporty is strongly correlated to team players. That's why it's here. So 46% of sporty devs are also team players. Remember, team players in the whole population is 37%, so considerably lower. So sporty tend to be team players. That's why we see them behaving in this way here. Another interesting thing is that specialists. So one, there are two things, two methods for which they have greens there, bright green. So they're twice as likely as others to have acquired a postgraduate degree, which by definition is a specialization into something, right? So it makes sense. But they're also far more likely to opt for on-the-job training. So this is their preferred method, far higher than others. Of course, second to being self-taught as anybody else. Now, team players are the ones who prefer online courses the most. There's a lot of buzz about online courses, and there are myriads of them out there about coding. Well, not all of them, not all of developers prefer them. Actually, they're not as popular as one might think. And it's team players who prefer them the most, and along with, and they also prefer developer bootcamps, along with the extroverts. Loners, on the other hand, if you can see, they're all yellows and reds, except for self-teaching. So in their case, all the interactive activities are perhaps not recommended. Best provide them with easy-to-learn tools and good documentation, and leave them in peace to figure it all out by themselves. Another way in which you could potentially use psychographics is if you're trying to profile very specific development areas. So what we have done here is that we have isolated data scientists and machine learning developers. We have kicked out everybody else that may be in this space. And we looked at the psychographics of this group. And we wanted to see if there's a difference of the psychographics of those involved in different AI areas. We just picked a few interesting areas. There, of course, we track a lot more. And interesting findings are as follows. So medical diagnostics is broadly considered a highly specialized area. However, data scientists in this space don't consider themselves as specialists. They have the lowest percentage of specialists by far at 18%. On the contrary, those who are into recommendation systems do consider themselves as specialists far more, 35%. So why the difference? Well, it could be linked to other factors hiding behind this. So it could be linked to the way they do their job. So different algorithms that are typically used in these two areas. And it would perhaps be interesting as a next step to check the correlation between algorithms used and perception specialization, because there are differences in algorithms used. For example, principal components analysis are used by 24% of those into medical diagnostics as compared to 14% of those into recommendation systems. Data scientists into fraud detection are the most logical, they're readers, they're team players, while they're the least sporty and artistic. So again, that makes sense with the application area that they selected. An interesting thing here is that loner is also relatively high in this group at 14%. And as we said, loner and team player don't go together. So what this may mean is that this group should basically be split down further, and there are subgroups within fraud detection gang. There's also the speech recognition people who are not much of, they're not really readers. They don't like that much. And perhaps that's why they went into speech recognition in the first place. And then finally, last but not least, those into AI in games. Same as with game developers, they're highly artistic and not that logical. So overall, what we see is that developers and data scientists and whoever else, they're just picking to do things. They're selecting things that match their psyche, right? Which is not very surprising. So at the end of the day, how do we use psychographics and how do we not use them? So we still find that everything else, motivations, roles, and so on, education, are far better predictors of technology choices than psychographics can be. However, you can use psychographics along with other predictors to describe developer personas and predict their choices. I would use them on top of motivations if they surface as significant in any segmentation models, to explain that extra variability that may not be explained fully by other factors. But you have to be careful and first of all take into account other things such as age that we observed, because behaviors that are seemingly explained by psychographics, they may be in fact be determined by other hidden factors, what we call in statistics possibly confining factors. So if it's age rather than gaming that is determining choices, you do want to use age because there's much more into age than just the attitude towards gaming or not. So it's a stronger predictor and you want to use that, and gamer may or may not come into play if it explains a little bit more than what age can predict on its own. Now, all that said, psychographic profiles may prove very useful when he's designing your messaging to developers. So as we saw, there are anitals and early birds. So that may help you decide when to send out a campaign, for example. There are loners who don't like human interaction that much, so you wouldn't want to invite them to a big noisy event. You might want to choose another more discreet way of communication. And also what you include in the content may be more focused, I don't know, on sports or whatever else, team playing or anything that is related to their psychographics. So that's the best way to use psychographics on top of everything else. Right, and with that, let's open this to your questions, please.
Thanks, Christina. Thank you very much. Getting started, we had a question early on, and I wanted to go back to that to make sure we cover it. What type, it was slide 8, actually, you showed DevOps and robotics at the beginning. What type of robotics do you mean? Just to clarify, is it hardware or software as well?
It's both. I would need to go into the questionnaire and see exactly how we ask about it, but I don't think so. What we do is that we ask developers, which of these areas are you interested in learning about or currently working on? And robotics is one of them. I don't recall if we ask specific about hardware or software. To make the distinction, we also have robotics under AI questions. So that's, I guess, the software behind robotics, right? So how they build algorithms, that computer vision, all that.
Thank you. So I have a few questions that came through Q&A. So have we also conducted word association analysis besides beyond the pair words that we have to get a full picture of the developer psychographics?
Well, yeah, we've run some extensive analysis here, and academically speaking, you could be digging into this forever because of all the other data that we have in our survey, and you could cross-tabulate it against. Yeah, we tried a few things here. We're just showing you the tip of the iceberg, what was just indicative insights on how psychographics could be used. I'm not sure if there's interested in particular topic or...
Yeah, if sorry, the names, we're not able to see your names for some reason this time, but if you have the person that added that question, if you wanted to jump in and add something to it, feel free. Okay. So going on to a couple more questions that came through. You mentioned the segmentation, and of course the segmentation is really interesting. Is there an optimum number of segments that we should be aiming for?
Well, yeah, well, there's a rule of thumb, if that's what you're looking for. So roughly practitioners say you should have between 4 and 9 is sort of a magic number, but there is no magic number in truth. You should focus more in identifying clusters that are distinct with respect to their features and their behavior, but at the same time, they're not too niche. Okay, so they're sizable on one hand, but they're also distinct in terms of profile and behavior. So usually, I won't take you into the statistical metrics that we use for that, but usually that ends up being something between 3 and 9. If you end up with more than 10 or something, then you should really go back and look into the usefulness of the whole split there. If you end up with 2, maybe you're not really getting all the precision that you might get if you split them down further.
Is it okay if they're different sizes though?
Yeah, they're typically different sizes. There are smaller ones and bigger ones, but you don't want, neither the too small or the too big ones, because they're too big. So for example, some people tend to segment developers based on their revenues, okay? But there's a very, very big long tail there, and something like, especially in games, most developers actually either don't care or they're not making any money at all. So if you try to segment based on revenues, you would end with something like 80% of developers in a single segment. And that's not meaningful at all, because you basically end up with the same population minus a 20% that are the high revenue makers. So yeah, they do differ in size. They're not the exact same size, of course, but you should steer clear of really big ones, because obviously you have missed something. And unless you're talking about a really homogeneous population, which is rarely the case. And that the whole idea is to segment them exactly because they're not homogeneous, and you want to identify more homogeneous clusters.
Thank you. Another question coming in. They're mentioning, I've seen other data that suggests that developers really like conferences as well. What can you do to make an event successful with a demographic that is a loner if they are important to your brand? It seems that even loners go to conferences, maybe if it's the right one.
They might. Yes, these are not strict rules here, right? It's on average, they don't like big events. By the way, we do have separate research on events and which events and who goes to which. But maybe you would consider online sessions for them. So have recordings available for them. In that way, you still get your message through, and they don't have to face the frustration of mixing with people or traveling.
So, I mean, you mentioned some of the research, okay, and the sort of which events developers are going to, and how and where they're going to get info and stuff. Have you looked as well as sort of have you looked? I mean, how does that work with the psychographics as well? So have we actually looked into that, or can we look into that and look at psychographics and which events they're going to?
We can. We don't have it off the shelf, but yes, we can.
Okay.
We can look at which events they go to.
I always like, before we close, actually, to always ask this. So especially with you, Christina, you're involved, you've been doing the developer research, you've been running the team here at /Data, but you've been doing this for a long time now. And looking at a topic like this, what was there something that stuck out most to you, or that wasn't expected in what you've shown us today? Or was there something that was a surprise, if you will?
No, not really surprise. Again, I was surprised to see that only a small majority, so 58, would consider themselves logical. I would expect to see that being higher. But overall, my key takeaway here is that, all right, so psychographics are in fact correlated to their, let's say, primary choices. So which sectors they go in, like AR and VR, that are more artistic, which type of applications they build, games versus fraud detection or whatever. But otherwise, and they can be used in your messaging. But otherwise, I would first of all look into the main descriptors, and keep psychographics as an add-on where needed so basically to help you fine-tune your messaging, how it should be and when and through which channels maybe. Yeah, but things should be used in the right context. There's no magic solution here. So yeah, that's my key takeaway. They cannot be trusted on their own to describe developer behavior, only as an add-on and for specific uses.
That's great. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's a wrap. If you have any questions following up, please do respond to the email shoutouts you'll be getting where we're sending the slides over. So feel free to respond and we'll get back to you and connect. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.